Deep inside a limestone cave in northern Spain, a researcher brushes dust away from a fragment of bone the size of a coin. It's a neck bone. It belonged to a child, somewhere between 2 and 5 years old, who died roughly 850,000 years ago, long before anything resembling a modern human walked this stretch of Europe. Along one edge, under magnification, a series of small, precise cuts become visible. Not random damage. Not the work of a predator's teeth, which tend to leave ragged punctures rather than clean lines. Deliberate marks, made by a stone tool, at exactly the points a person would need to cut through if they were removing a head from a body. What could possibly explain marks that precise, that deliberate, on someone so young? That single bone has forced scientists to rewrite what they thought they understood about one of the earliest human relatives ever found in Europe. This isn't a story about monsters. It's stranger, and more unsettling, than that. The species is called Homo antecessor, and it lived in what is now Spain roughly 1.2 million to 770,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest known human relatives on the European continent. For decades, everything scientists knew about this species came from a single cave system, Gran Dolina, part of the Sierra de Atapuerca archaeological complex, a site so rich with layered evidence that it has become one of the most important windows into early European prehistory anywhere on Earth. What makes a single cave system so valuable to researchers, generation after generation? Gran Dolina isn't one discovery. It's dozens of stacked layers of sediment, each one a different slice of time, deposited over hundreds of thousands of years as the cave slowly filled in. Archaeologists refer to these layers by code, and one in particular, a layer known as TD6, has produced the vast majority of the human remains found at the site. Digging through TD6 means digging through time itself, one careful centimeter at a time, cross-referencing stone tools, animal bones, and human remains all found together in the same narrow slice of soil. What made this site strange from the very beginning? Nearly 30 years ago, researchers working the same excavation level made a discovery that shocked the field, clear evidence that Homo antecessor individuals had processed the bodies of other members of their own species, using the same butchering techniques applied to deer, horses, and other prey animals found in the same layer of soil. That alone would be remarkable. What came next made it far harder to dismiss as an isolated incident. Over the following decades, archaeologist Palmira Saladi and her colleagues at Atapuerca kept digging, and kept finding more. By the most recent excavation seasons, the count of individuals recovered from this single site had climbed to somewhere between 13 and 15 separate people, an unusually large sample for a species this old. That number matters more than it might seem. Most fossil human relatives from this deep in prehistory are known from a single skull fragment, a jaw, maybe a handful of teeth. Having over a dozen individuals from one small group lets researchers ask questions that were simply impossible before, not just, did this happen, but, how often, to whom, and, in what pattern. And the pattern held. Roughly 30% of all the human bones recovered from Gran Dolina carry cut marks consistent with butchering. 30% isn't an accident. Isn't a one-time act of desperation during a single terrible winter. That's a habit. So picture what that actually means, laid out plainly. Skull fragments. Vertebrae. Arm bones, leg bones, teeth, scattered across the same layer of cave soil as the bones of hyenas, deer, and rhinoceros, processed with the same stone tools, in the same systematic way. Not a single grim outlier. A repeated, ordinary part of how this group survived. Why would this be routine, instead of a last resort? The leading explanation ties directly to where and when these people lived. Homo antecessor existed in a landscape crowded with large, dangerous competitors, cave hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and other predators, all hunting the exact same prey, all willing to fight for the exact same shelter. The animal bones found in the same layer as the human remains tell part of this story on their own. Deer, horses, beavers, even rhinoceros, butchered and processed with the same flint, quartzite, and sandstone tools found scattered throughout the cave. Meat, in this world, was not guaranteed. It had to be taken, defended, and used efficiently, whatever its source. Imagine competing directly against animals built specifically to kill and to scavenge, animals with better night vision, sharper teeth, and no internal hesitation about what counts as prey. Losing a kill to a hyena pack wasn't a minor inconvenience. It could mean the difference between eating that week and not eating at all. Under that kind of pressure, a body, any body, may simply have represented calories that couldn't be wasted. Here's where the story gets more complicated, and more interesting, than a simple headline about prehistoric cannibals. Not every researcher agrees on exactly what these cut marks prove. Paleoanthropologist Michael Pant, at Colorado State University, has pushed back on one of the more recent, more disturbing finds, the cut-marked neck bone belonging to that 2 to 5-year-old child. His point is a careful one. A cut mark proves cutting. It doesn't automatically prove eating, and the distance between those two claims matters enormously when you're trying to understand people who left behind no words to explain themselves. Could there be another explanation entirely? Pant has raised the possibility of a funerary ritual instead, a deliberate, careful way of treating the dead that had nothing to do with hunger at all. Some human cultures, both ancient and startlingly recent, have practiced forms of defleshing the dead as part of mourning, a way of preparing a body for its next stage rather than consuming it as food. He's openly skeptical of a third theory too, one suggesting the child may have been killed and processed as a message to a rival group, a kind of prehistoric warning sign. In his own words, there simply isn't strong evidence for that particular explanation, no matter how dramatic it might sound in a headline. This tension between researchers isn't a weakness in the science. It's exactly how good science is supposed to work. A cut mark is physical evidence, precise and undeniable. What that cut mark meant to the person who made it 850,000 years ago is a much harder question, and honest researchers disagree openly about how far the physical evidence can really take you before you're filling in gaps with assumption instead of proof. What almost everyone agrees on, though, is the timing and the pattern. This wasn't a single desperate winter. It was a practice, repeated across generations, embedded deeply enough into how this group lived that traces of it kept turning up, cave layer after cave layer, for nearly 30 years of careful excavation. So who were the people this happened to? That's the detail that should sit with you longest. These weren't strangers glimpsed from a distance and mythologized into monsters. Andrew All, another researcher on the excavation team, has pointed out that the growing number of adult remains found alongside the children finally let scientists study this population the way you'd study any other group of people, not as a handful of isolated, shocking cases, but as a real community, with real demographic structure, real relationships, real internal life that happened to include this one deeply unsettling practice as part of how it survived. Before this recent wave of discoveries, most of what researchers had to work with were the bones of children and adolescents, which made it tempting to imagine something almost exclusively predatory happening to the most vulnerable members of the group. Adults changed that picture. If grown members of the community were processed using the same methods, in similar numbers, the story stops looking like the targeted exploitation of the weak and starts looking like something closer to an unsentimental, group-wide practice, applied without much apparent regard for age at all. Here's the twist that should reframe how you picture this: the discomfort you feel reading about this isn't really about cruelty. It's about categories. You want there to be a clean line between us and something else, between a person and a resource, between family and food. Homo antecessor, as far as the evidence suggests, may not have drawn that line in the same place you do. That doesn't necessarily mean less feeling, less social bond, less grief. Elsewhere in the human fossil record, deliberate burial and evident care for the vulnerable show up again and again, sometimes in cultures separated by hundreds of thousands of years from each other. It may simply mean a different, harder calculation about what a body becomes once the person who used to live inside it is already gone. That's a genuinely uncomfortable thought, and it's worth sitting with rather than flinching away from. It's easier, in a way, to imagine Homo antecessor as simply alien to you, a different kind of creature entirely, operating by rules that have nothing to do with anything you'd recognize. The harder, truer possibility is that they were recognizably people, making a version of the same hard calculations people have always made, just under conditions brutal enough to push those calculations somewhere you'd rather not follow. Modern humans still draw these lines everywhere, all the time, usually without noticing. Which animals count as food and which count as companions, a distinction that shifts by culture and by decade, and that most people never examine closely enough to notice how arbitrary it actually is. Which deaths in wartime get called tragedies and which get filed away as statistics, distant numbers on a screen rather than people who had names. Which bodies, historically, medical science has considered fair to study, dissect, and use without asking permission first, a history far more recent, and far closer to home, than 850,000 years. None of this is meant to excuse what happened in that cave. It's meant to complicate the easy version of the story, the one where this is simply about savagery and everything since has been enlightened progress. The instinct to sort the world into what deserves care and what doesn't is ancient, and it hasn't gone anywhere. Homo antecessor simply drew a version of that same line in a place that feels, to you, unbearably far in the wrong direction. The line itself, the habit of drawing one at all, is something you still share with them. Back in that cave in northern Spain, the excavation continues. Every summer, Atapuerca returns to Gran Dolina, and nearly every summer, the ground gives up a few more fragments, a tooth, a vertebra, a piece of forearm bone, each one adding a small amount of certainty to a picture that is still, deliberately, not finished. 30 years in, and the team still describes each new season as forcing them to rethink how this group lived, how they died, and how the dead among them were treated. That willingness to keep revising the picture, rather than settling on the most dramatic version and stopping there, is itself part of what makes this research trustworthy. Deep inside that limestone cave, a researcher is still brushing dust away from bone. Not to confirm that something monstrous happened there, but to understand, as precisely as 850,000 years of dirt will allow, exactly what kind of people they actually were, and exactly how they made sense of a world that gave them almost nothing for free.